introduction of Ulysses Grant Dietz, who is our senior curator at the Newark Museum and also our curator of decorative arts. And if you've had a chance to go into the Ballantine House yet, or if you've been in there before, the way that building is presented and all of the decorative arts and furnishings that are part of that are really a direct responsibility of Ulysses' involvement with the Newark Museum. I could list lots of accomplishments, but I'm going to keep this short and sweet at his wish. He is a graduate of Yale University and the Winter Tour program in 1980, and he's been working at the Newark Museum ever since and doing wonderful things for us. So I'm just going to turn the lectern over to Ulysses and be prepared to be inspired. Thank you.
That's always a hard thing to live up to, but I'm delighted to be here today, and when Ted asked me to step in and do this, I thought, okay, it's always chancy when anyone here asks me to talk. And I actually went up and printed off my notes and realized that I stopped writing them down halfway through the talk. So if you have any questions about the second half of the talk, forget it, because I forgot to write it all down. But I think I've got it here. Because I'm not trained as a historian. I'm trained as an art historian and a material cultural historian. I mean, that's my degree, is in early American culture, whatever that means. It's sort of looking at objects and trying to figure out what they mean in context. And so that's what I thought I'd do. So a little bit, there's a certain irony in the title here. And so a good deal of the content of this talk is based on things that I'm very interested in as a decorative arts curator, and clearly the idea is to figure out how to use objects in a way to underscore what's happening in history. Because it's interesting enough to realize that the history of material culture is oddly detached from politics, but not totally detached. I did a book with a friend on the White House called Dream House, which analyzes the White House over time and how it relates to some of the ideas in this talk, but how it relates to the notion of what home means to all of us in America over the course of the last 200 years. And I seem to have pissed off the curator at the White House, but that's my favorite accomplishment with that. But it was an interesting way to look at it, and some of the ideas in this came out of that, realizing that the White House is kind of emblematic of the way we all fantasize about what home ought to be, whether we live up to it or not. And that comes out in this too, because what I'd been asked to do was to look at the sort of the Gilded Age and what happens with all of the economic and socioeconomic shifts that are going on in the background, just simply to look at houses, the domestic context, to see how this plays out on the material sphere. So as you see, I have the word progress in quotes because one of the notions that I'm working on for an exhibition in 2015 is that the notion of progress in taste, which is espoused by and was the founding premise of most museums in the Western world, and especially in this country, is basically false. It's a fallacy forced on us by the rich of the Gilded Age. And I haven't actually publicized that idea very much because when I'm trying to pitch the show to other museums, I can't say that out loud. But basically, it's an idea that's got some traction. So some of the ideas in here may be experimental or just crazy, but we can argue about that later. And I'm hoping I will stick to facts, though, and give you visual illustrations of some of these ideas. And of course, I mean, this is such an obvious idea, but the Civil War really does change everything. And it's always struck me as bizarre that in terms of the aesthetic shifts in the United States, styles of art and so on, wars really are a watershed. They're not an absolute watershed. It's not like 1917, everything is one thing, and in 1918, when the war is over in Europe, that it's all different, and that's not true. But the shifts definitely sort of hinge around historic political moments. But if you want to illustrate a dramatic shift from A to B before and after the Civil War, on the left you have a published villa from 1850, a Gothic villa with all of the accoutrements of middle-class gentility, and I'm going to go into this in some depth, but it's basically a suburban house. Imagine, you know, my 1930s Tudor house, but this is 1850 with a little conservatory here. All of this is totally redolent of what's going on in America in the 1850s. And this is 1878. This is a house built at the top of Nob Hill, the highest point in San Francisco, by Mark Hopkins, one of the great railroad magnates. And he built it in the sense that his money built it. But the truth is, his wife built it, and his wife furnished it, and he didn't give a crap, and he died. So it's basically her house, but with his name on it, which is another bit of material culture, is that men get credit for everything, when in fact, on the domestic scale, it's often the women who are the driving force. But we'll step back a little bit and look at this, because these are both in the Gothic style, but you can see there is a mild difference between the two. The vocabulary has changed, but the, how do you put it, the length of the words has gotten different. So, and everything I'm going to show is either in this collection or in some other museum. And it's the idea that I'm hoping it'll give you ideas how you can go into places that might be unlikely for you and show how that these objects reflect an idea that you're talking about. Because even if you go through the period, the European period rooms in the Metropolitan Museum, you can actually find objects that relate to this, because it depends on who brought them into the Metropolitan when they acquired them. On your left is a house, it's a historic house called the Victoria Mansion, which is a title I would expunge if I could, but it's actually the Morse Libby House in Portland, Maine, and it was built by a very rich southern hotelier who would come up from the deep south, from New Orleans, and bring his southern hotel taste with him, and he built an absolutely archetypal middle-class villa, very richly, on a hill in Portland, which at that point looked down at the water. You can't see the water from this house anymore because Portland grew up around it. But it's not a very big house. It's basically a 10-room house with a tower, classic right out of A.J. Downing's Architecture of Country Houses, which was sort of the middle-class compendium of what do we do when we want to build a house in the suburbs. And the thing is, he just decorated it very richly. But this is about as big as it got. This is one of the most opulent houses before the Civil War in America. There's nothing that tops it. And this painting here from the Brooklyn Museum of the 1870s shows a family, an actual portrait of a family sitting in their parlor in Brooklyn in 1872, which is after the war, but everything in this image is sort of pre-war in terms of its iconography. And this is what America was supposed to be. We were supposed to be nice, genteel, educated, cultured people. We were supposed to have good taste, whatever that meant. Nobody seems to define it, but they talk about it a lot. We live suitably, and our things are suitable to our life. So you have stuff like wall-to-wall carpeting and comfy furniture and, I don't know, modern lighting fixtures and art on the walls, including ancestral portraits, of course, because we all have ancestors, right? And puppies and children and all the good things. Education, you send your kids off to school. I mean, a curator, I promise you, could go through all of this and bore you to tears analyzing all of the objects in this room. But this was basically the idea that this was what we were supposed to be as a nation, and it didn't matter if you lived in San Francisco or in New York or wherever else development had begun to crop up in this period. All along the great rivers and all along the railroads that connected with the rivers to create a huge marketplace for all of the products being produced in whatever city they were made. Now what happens after the Civil War, and these are actually the two first houses of their kind to be built, and one of them exists and one of them doesn't. One's city and one's country. On the left is the product of the first great department store in America. Alexander Taggart Stewart was a Scottish-born dry goods merchant who managed to build up an enormous department store called the Marble Palace in New York City, and basically created the concept of the modern department store, an enormous space with an endless variety of goods that are shipped in from all over the country and all over the world to sell to consumers. And he took that money, and with his wife, they had no children, in their 50s, they built this house on Fifth Avenue in New York City. And I should have, it was that tall, but see how big these people are? Okay, you get a sense of the scale of this. It was a 40,000 square foot house for two people with no children who were Presbyterians, who didn't drink and didn't entertain. It was the most bizarre idea. Why would you do this? And that's one of the questions I'm trying to figure out. And part of it is just because you have all this money, and somehow money will be spent, whether you want it to or not. He died in the early 1880s. His wife died in 1886. And the Greek slave in the Newark Museum collection came from this house. So it's one of the things I've always been interested in. I'm so sorry. It was torn down in 1890. It didn't even make it to the end of the century. And this is the country version of that. This was also built by another industrialist who made his fortune during and because of the Civil War, Legrand Lockwood, which is such a Victorian. It's a name right out of a Dickens novel. And he builds this house, and the reason, and it's called Elm Park. It still survives. You can still go see it. It's 45,000 square feet, based modestly on the floor plan of St. Peter's in Rome, which you know is a dangerous signal when you're building a house in the country. And in spite of the modest name, Elm Park, it was a mammoth undertaking, and it was the first really over-the-top house in the country, in America. And I put this in here, this H here, which stands for human. Imagine this is a couple holding hands on the veranda, and you get a sense of the scale. These columns are 20 feet tall. It's not just a little Victorian house with a porch. It's huge. And even when you stand in front of it, you feel like there's a weird sense of Disney scale, because it's so much bigger than it feels like it ought to be. But it was certainly in its time the richest interiors in the country, and in fact it was decorated by the same people who did this house. Now I will also say that Legrand Lockwood was put out of business by Commodore Vanderbilt, who decided he wasn't going to share the railroads with anybody. And bringing to this image, which is something I'm hoping I'm going to borrow for the exhibition in 2015. This is a very modestly titled picture, Going to the Opera, by Seymour Guy, who was a great genre painter of the middle of the 19th century. We have a couple of them in our collection, but this is one that's large. It's about 4 feet wide, and it's a very specific thing with that murky little title called Going to the Opera. It's got a backstory, but I call your attention to the fact that it's in a New York townhouse. Certainly in this period, it represents that kind of very high-end, the most elaborate kind of house that Americans lived in, but it still hasn't tipped outside that sort of upper middle class trope that Americans were meant to keep to. And the reason this family hasn't tipped is because he hasn't inherited yet. This is William Henry Vanderbilt, who is the son of Commodore Vanderbilt, the one who will inherit all the money. All the other children are basically disinherited. And they all live out on Staten Island, and they're very bitter. But the Commodore, in 1873, the Commodore is still alive, sitting on a fortune of $100 million, which is, in fact, more than Queen Victoria's worth. And when he dies, this son gets it all, and these are his children. And they will, each one of these people will build one of the largest houses in the Western Hemisphere within the next 10, 15 years. And so it's like this moment. They're all, I think of them as like birds of prey, these women in their incredibly opulent clothes that way outclass the sort of high bourgeois decoration of the house itself. So this is this moment before the money gates are unleashed and that money bursts out onto the scene. Because $100 million in 1877, in just counting for inflation, is something over $2 billion today. And that doesn't even count on its purchasing power and labor costs and all of that. Now, to show you that people were not oblivious to this, someone else made his fortune writing about this, and it's a book I highly recommend to everybody. It's a fascinating, rather chilling story, funny but not really funny, called The Gilded Age by Samuel Clemens, better known to all of us as Mark Twain. And here's the cover of the book, which became a bestseller in 1873, called The Gilded Age, A Tale of Today. And there he is, as he looked in 1871, not the scraggy, white-haired man that we know, but the young, red-headed, dynamic speaker and stand-up comedian. He was sort of the Bill Maher of his time and was famous. He was a celebrity for doing this and got very rich. And so not only did he coin a term, which we use now as if it's a flattering term, and it's not, it's an insult, because the Gilded Age is different than the Golden Age. Gilt is fake, superficial, built on lies. The Golden Age was some imagined past, which of course never really existed, but we always deny that. And so he not only created this, I love the symbol, because the symbol of the time, this is the original, the first edition copy of it, and it's a diamond ring. And I think that's one of those little details that his audience would not have missed, because at this very moment in America, the first great brand name in Western marketing, Tiffany & Company, has become internationally famous because of their work in expositions. They have been showing off their diamonds. They're gearing up to buy the crown jewels of the Empress Eugenie when they get toppled during the Franco-Prussian War. But Tiffany is also down in South Africa in the early 1870s when the Kimberley pipes are discovered and they start selling diamonds to a middle-class market for the first time in human history. So diamonds become a symbol of this sudden burst of wealth because diamonds matter if there are people to buy them. And then Mark Twain falls for the same trap because when you have money, you spend it. And he builds himself an amazing little house up in Hartford, quaintly called Nook Farm, which is, as he described it, half steamboat, half cuckoo clock. I mean, he actually said that about it. But what it really was a radical modern house by a modern architect working in Hartford, and it's an amazing place to go visit. It was also one of the first Victorian houses seriously restored during my lifetime, and it was an inspiration to me to come here. But to go back for a second, because I want to remind you what the norm was supposed to be. Here you have, this is an extraordinary documentary image of a couple living in a shack on the frontier in Minnesota in the 1870s. It's a postcard that they have made from a photograph of themselves. So it's a middle-class American couple pretending with all their might that living out on the howling edge of wilderness in Minnesota that they're genteel Americans the way they're supposed to be, this rather overweening bust of Shakespeare and all of the pictures, and he has his velvet smoking jacket and we actually have slippers like this. These are called chenille work slippers. They're knitted, they're embroidered and clipped by his loving wife. And they're sitting there trying very hard to look like they live like this all the time, when in fact there are probably literally wolves at the door outside their house. And then in the East Coast, this is in fact a house in Burlington, New Jersey that still stands, a nice little middle-class villa where U.S. Grant and his family kept sheltered away from the Civil War so he could be near to Philadelphia, but out of the line of fire for his family. But this is the way Americans were supposed to live, and it wasn't supposed to get any fancier than this. But then after the Civil War, it's not that disappears. The middle class doesn't just disappear, and in fact, the suburb I live in Maplewood, New Jersey, just like 5 miles that way, is entirely based on that early Downing notion of what a genteel suburb is supposed to be, that it's nice houses with nice people and we all live according to the way we're supposed to live. But after the Civil War, this vast amount of money, which had always been in the South before, the South had controlled most of the wealth in the United States. It was all based in a slave economy, and as that is crashing and burning, literally, during the Civil War, the North is getting richer and richer and richer. The production of sterling silver in American factories tripled during the Civil War, and by 1873, the Gorham Manufacturing Company in Providence, Rhode Island, made more silver in that one factory than all of England. So we had totally outstripped the rest of the world in terms of luxury good consumption. And it wasn't just for the very rich. But the very rich saw this happening, and they began to say to themselves, okay, what's good enough for us what's good enough for them is not good enough for us, for whatever reason. And I must admit, I didn't analyze the family life of all of these other people, but I told you that A.T. Stewart and his wife Cornelia had no kids. But you have in Boston, Oliver Ames. This house still stands. It's one of the few. It's very hard to track down Boston houses because Boston has changed so much. But this is this mammoth sort of a brownstone chateau built by Oliver Ames, who was in on the railroad scams that built the railroads across the country. There's a wonderful book by Richard White called Railroaded that I'm reading now, which basically says that the railroads in America were basically a Ponzi scheme that made all of the men who built them rich and basically bankrupted everybody else. But you can advise yourself on that if you want. Oh, sorry, wrong button. And then in New York, the most sort of famous icon of the moment, in the face of all of these big brownstones that had been built on Fifth Avenue for the last 30 years, you get the William H. Vanderbilt's house. He's the man we saw in the picture sitting there with all of his children. And when the money flood came in 1877, when the Commodore dies, William Henry inherits $100 million, and he doles out $10 million to each of his children. which $10 million in 1877 is the equivalent of several $100 million today in terms of buying power. So they all promptly build houses. His daughter-in-law, Alva, builds this house at 660 Fifth Avenue, and Mr. Vanderbilt, for him and his daughter, Mrs. Shepherd, built this sort of twin house, a two-family, if you will, each of them with about 45,000 square feet, which cost not only $1 million to build, but $800,000 to decorate in 1883. The Ballantyne house costs $100,000 and $16,000 to decorate. So $800,000 is a lot of decorating, and that's the kind of divide. The Ballantynes are pushing the limit already in the 1880s, but the Vanderbilts take it to a whole new level, and I think they sort of changed the game plan rather bizarrely. And the thing about these houses is that they were modern. William Vanderbilt has an entire book ghostwritten about his house. It's this opulent leather-bound volume with color plates and photographs, and it's using all of the modern technology of magazine publishing and photography to describe his fabulous new house, which he, with no irony, calls a typical American home suited for the way we live. Well, not hardly, but it's like watching Cribs on television or something like that, not suited for the way nobody actually lives. But he keeps emphasizing the modernity and the Americanness of that house. And that's what you have to think about. When you look at a Victorian interior, you're not looking at an old interior, you're looking at modern. You're looking at cutting edge, you're looking at, I don't know what, Mies van der Rohe in the 1930s. You're looking at the ultra-modern design. This is one of the images that the NEH provided, and it actually, you know, I think it's a wrong image, because this house is bought by Mr. Freer of Detroit, whose house is still standing in Detroit, right near the Detroit Art Institute. But in fact, he buys it in 1904 out of an English house after the Englishman who commissions it in 1877 dies. So this is English modern, but it does make a point, and it's also by Whistler, who is an American artist, but basically turns his back on this country completely. So, but the difference between this and this is a matter of scale and artistic subtlety, but essentially what they are both is modern. This is our Ballantyne house, done in a totally modern style, which is completely American, in that it is a hodgepodge of all sorts of stuff that doesn't, it nods to everything and kowtows to nothing, because it has Japanese windows and Renaissance paneling and a colonial fireplace. And so it has all of this, this mixture of style, which in fact was meant to be new. It was meant to be something that had never been seen before. These are not people copying old patterns. They're creating something new, and what they're doing is they're doing it in a way that is richer than other people to separate themselves, and really expressing quite visually the increasing gulf between the middle class and the upper class. The Ballantynes are pretty paltry. They're only worth about $5 or $6 million compared to the Vanderbilt's $100 million, but that's more than enough to go around. The average salary for a maid in 1885 was $2 a week, so that gives you a sense of why people could have so many servants. I don't know if any of you have been watching Downton Abbey, but I keep like chatting online with friends to sort of explain to them this whole English cultural system that was based on cheap servant labor, because Americans don't get that anymore. And this happens everywhere in America at the same time. There's this self-conscious separation between the middle-class ideal of the pre-Civil War era and the upper-class, exclusive, custom-made, artistic ideal of modernity in that the elite adopt. And these two images fascinate me. This one is of the Blue Room in the White House as it was under the Pierces, as it was redecorated for the Pierces. And this is even before the new furniture. This furniture comes in under the Buchanan administration. His niece, Harriet Lane, buys all of this from a furniture maker in Philadelphia. But this is still older stuff that's been lurking around. So basically, the White House is a middle-class house, but huge. It's a bizarre house because it's the biggest house in North America until 1870, until these rich people start building their huge houses. And nobody knows how to live in it because we're a middle-class people, and nobody who lives in the White House is a rich industrialist. I was going to say ever, because I'm trying to think we really, I mean, they all get rich somehow, but the big money, the J.P. Morgans and the Rockefellers, they don't want to be the president. They want to control the president. Being the president is a pain in the ass. Controlling him is easy because it's just about money. So this sort of middle-class interior, which is just this is the biggest oval room in North America. well into the, I mean, it's 40 by 20 by 22 feet high. It's an enormous room. And here it is. This is a fantasy created by a computer graphics person of how Louis Tiffany decorated the room for Chester Arthur. Chester Arthur comes in from New York City as president. He's a bachelor, although he will get married in the house eventually. And he thinks this is way too bourgeois. I live in New York. I know the Vanderbilts. I hobnob with these people. I know the Tiffanys. And Charlie Tiffany, who runs that great store, his son Louis wants to be a decorator. So I'm going to bring him down here, and he's going to really do up the White House. Of course, Congress just throws a fit and doesn't give him enough money. So Louis Tiffany has to keep Julia Grant chandelier. He has to keep the Buchanan's furniture, but he covers it in silk canvas. And he paints the walls in a shade going from robin's egg blue down to darker blue, and the curtains all match this. But this is some of the furniture from the Monroes, and that's something from the Pierces. And so there's stuff kicking around. Those were Andrew Jackson's. But then Louis Tiffany provides these huge silver sconces set with opalescent glass, and all of this is done in silver and white with little symbols of stars and stripes all mixed into this exoticism. There's nothing period about this. This is modern. This is like crazy modern art interior. And of course it goes out of business very quickly. And then you can see Louis Tiffany does a whole screen, a massive stained glass screen across the entrance hall in the White House, which is literally smashed up with sledgehammers and thrown into a dump in the early 20th century because taste changes. Because this is the way the rich start to isolate themselves from everybody else, by doing custom artistic handmade stuff. And I'll talk more about that. I'm throwing in another NEH symbol because this is something they should have used, but this is actually, and I've forgotten what museum owns this, but something as obvious that even in this culture where this is becoming increasingly meaningless. I mean, my kids, I love silver, and my kids look at me like, what the hell? And because it just sits there tarnishing in my house. But it's this is, in the 18th century, this is a teapot by Paul Revere, which would be sort of one of those iconic, all genuflect when we hear the name of Paul Revere. But he was a businessman and a silversmith, and a silversmith was equivalent to being a banker in the 18th century. They controlled raw money in terms of gold and silver. But in the 18th century, all you needed was a teapot. If you had a silver teapot by anybody in any town in what was developed in America at the time, you were an aristocrat. I mean, it didn't take much because so few people had silver. If you were sort of on your way up, you might order a set of 6 spoons. But by the middle of the 19th century, by the Civil War, when Mary Lincoln and her yen for shopping move into the White House, everybody has silver. Everybody who considers themselves middle class or up has some silver. Silver has become not just a luxury, but a necessity for gentility, for middle class aspiration. And this isn't even fancy, but this is, she goes to Gorham in New York City and buys this wonderful little chicken leg set, a tea set, just to use on her tea table. The Red Room in the White House is the parlor for all of the president's families. It's not a room for dinner parties. It's where they sit every day, and this is where what she serves tea with for her friends in the Red Room when she's during there. But she owns this herself. And this belongs, I think this may belong to the White House again. I don't know. This wasn't on the Smithsonian list, and I'm not sure why, because it's so iconic of the moment. But then you get these 2 sets, which were both made in Newark at about the same time, and this shows you distinctly why things begin to shift dramatically at the end of the 19th century, in the middle of the Gilded Age. On the one hand, Newark becomes a major production center for precious metals. It's the center of the jewelry industry, it's the center of the silversmithing industry, just one of the centers for silversmithing. But on the one hand, in 1902, this 3-piece sterling silver coffee set made by Unger Brothers in the city of Newark would have sold at jewelry stores all over the United States. They marketed them as wedding gifts, as birthday presents, anniversary gifts, $25 for a sterling silver 3-piece coffee set. It's very lightweight, it's mechanical, it's stamped out like a hubcap. If you look at these things, there are seams down the sides where they've taken the 2 halves and soldered them together. The stuff is paper thin. Often it has holes in it from polishing. This is in our collection. And actually this belonged to Thomas Edison. And it was given to us by the people who bought the house. Who bought a house from his son. Anyway, it's too complicated, never mind. But this did belong to Thomas Edison, which means it belonged to his second wife, Mina, because Thomas Edison didn't serve after dinner coffee. He just sat there and smoked cigars probably, just like U.S. Grant. And this is the same time and the same place. This is made in Newark by Tiffany and Company in their huge factory up in Forest Hill that had 500 employees working 7 days a week making silver and gold objects. And this is an 18-karat gold coffee set made for a couple as a golden wedding anniversary gift in 1897, right on the heels of the Yukon gold strike. Because this is what's extremely important. Both silver and gold, much of it is coming out of American mines, which plunges the cost of raw material down to 20 cents an ounce for silver, and of course gold sticks at around $32 an ounce and doesn't begin to go. It's, what is it? Gold is like $1,800 an ounce now. I calculated this the other day. I paid $13,000 for this at auction 10 years ago, and it's now worth $50,000 for the gold alone. So I got a good deal on that. I'm not supposed to talk about prices, but sometimes as a curator I hit the market right. So, but I wanted, because all of this gold disappeared. There was a lot of gold made after the Yukon strike in the 1890s, because rich people wanted to separate themselves from, everybody could go out and buy a $25 silver coffee set, but only rich people could afford a solid gold coffee set. And not only that, I've got the original drawings for this and photocopies, and this is one of a kind. And that's the way you went to Tiffany's and you said, make me this, and it's the only one. Don't make any more. 200 hours of labor. This would have cost, did I write that down? Yes. This would have retailed for $1,500 in 1897, and I forgot to do the calculation into the modern. But that's, so here you, at least you can see $25, $1,500, mass production, one of a kind, handmade, 200 hours of labor going into that. And I have the whole list of every craftsman who worked on it and did every single bit of it. And there was a team of about 20 people who spent 200 hours putting that little, and the coffee pot's only 7 to 8 inches tall. It's tiny. But this is the way the elite in the Gilded Age push that gap farther and farther by creating objects that only kings would have thought of in the 18th century. And so just to go back to this point, these are both stained glass windows. This in the Ballantine house, made by Tiffany Studios for the Ballantine's Decorator in 1885. It cost $400 when it was new. For a window that's 3 by 4.5 feet. It's not an enormous window, and it's an allegory. This is one thing you did. It's an allegory of the Ballantine name. So one pretentious thing you could do as you started to isolate yourself from the hoi polloi is you could take on a coat of arms. But Newark was a Puritan city, and a coat of arms would have been seen as uppity by the really old families, and the Ballantines were nouveau riche. Ballantine's a perfectly good Scottish name. There's a coat of arms out there for them. But they decided to opt for allegory. So you have this crypto Art Nouveau, designed by an artist who was not famous then, Elihu Vedder, but he became famous. But he designs this for Louis Tiffany, and it's the Ballantine name in Gaelic, in Scottish Gaelic, means fire worshipper. So you have this Celtic priestess in her muddy green robes with her red hair, worshiping the sun while incense rises up. It's an astonishing, very cutting-edge work of modern art, which the family completely hated. Probably the only reason they left it in the house, because they didn't care. They didn't even know it was by Tiffany. This is in the Metropolitan Museum and is a somewhat later work by Tiffany Studios. But again, it's the power of modernity. This looks old-fashioned, but the idea of these windows that created landscapes that you could look out was something that had never been thought of anywhere in the world. This is really an idea that Louis Tiffany, as an artist and a decorator, the son of a very rich merchant, begins to develop as something all his own. And of course, like all entrepreneurs, he steals all the ideas of his workers, because all of these windows are being put together by anonymous workers working in the factory. And certainly the designer of this window was not Louis Tiffany. Louis Tiffany simply checked it off when it went through past his eyes. And it's all about who's in charge and who gets their name put on stuff. But the important thing is that these are custom-made, unique modern objects which isolate the people who live in these houses from everybody else. Because this is available at the same time. All the stuff I've talked about, the silver and the stained glass, these are modern too. This is part of a plated tea set made in Boston in the 1880s that you could have bought for about $8, even cheaper than sterling silver, because it's electroplated over base metal. The electroplating industry is vast. I mean, for every $1 of sterling silver sold, there's $3 of plated silver being sold and manufactured in America, and $3 is more than 3 times $1, because electroplate is a lot cheaper. So what you're really talking about is maybe 10 times as much plated silver being sold to middle class consumers as there is silver being made for middle and upper class people in America, which is why gold gets so hot for that very brief moment. And this is a window that just came out of a house next door that we're about to tear down out of the dining room there. And it's the middle class catalog version of the Ballantine window in the library in the Ballantine house. This is a Japanese aesthetic movement style window with all of the right colors. It's looking at what Louis Tiffany does. It's made in 1883, but the Polhemus family, who were a well-to-do middle-class family, probably order it out of a catalog. You can just look down a page and say, I'll take one of those and one of those and one of those. And it's mass-produced. It can be shipped. I mean, they're made by hand, but mass production means they're made on spec and they're made to order, and they can be shipped anywhere in the country, as opposed to the custom-made one-of-a-kind things that you have to commission through your decorator. And that, of course, is one of the founding premises of this. I don't know if it was any of you, but I noticed two people, to my delight, taking pictures of the sign over the back door that says, "Study your teacups," because I begged to leave that sign up there after the centennial, because that was a quote from our founding director, who believed that art was the decorative arts, that he didn't want to collect sculpture and painting. He was overruled by the trustees, but he really wanted to collect stuff like this, because this was art for everybody. And here you see a pot that we bought in 1910 for, where's the price? $8. It says museum, $8, because we're in the public library in 1910. So it says museum so that they know it goes to that storeroom rather than the library storeroom. And this little vase, 8 inches tall, was $8. It's handmade, hand-decorated, designed by an artist, but it was art that everybody could afford. Now, mind you, the last one of these that sold at auction sold for $125,000. So there are only 5 of them left in the world. So it's no longer for everybody. And it's very interesting, the arts and crafts movement has become a battleground for the post-Reagan super rich, and they fight over this stuff. I've been to dinner parties that would turn your hair. But here you are. This is the original label, Marblehead. It was developed as a pottery in New England to be a therapeutic sanatorium for people with nervous disorders. Have any of you tried to throw a pot ever? If you have a nervous disorder, trying to throw a pot's going to push you over the edge. I don't know. So they abandoned that side of it, but it became this sort of very highly regarded artistic endeavor that survived for about 20 years. And $8 doesn't seem like very much, and it's not really very much. So it's certainly suited to a middle and upper middle class idea, but it's the notion that you're buying a unique work of art. Of course, that's why there are only 5 of them. It's not totally unique, but sort of. And so this kind of premise that art could be for everybody, and that modern design therefore was for everybody, and that you could mass produce it and streamline it so that it wasn't expensive, really ticks off the elite. And this is where we're starting to get theoretical, because no museum has ever dared touch this topic. And I've just spent the day with the director of this museum. The director of this museum won't talk to me anymore, so I guess I'm screwed on that score. But these two houses are, and I was talking to the director of this one, John Blades, and the Bill Allman is the curator in the White House. And these two houses seem to be very different, but you can see, obviously, I'm using these slides to show off their similarities. This is a picture of the White House in 1902 or 1903, just when McKim, Mead, and White, spearheaded by Stanford White, who is the decorator of the 3 architects, has just totally been basically gutted and renovated, although they call it restored in the publicity of the time, to bring the White House up to speed. But what speed are they bringing it up to? There was this notion that the White House was dowdy and old-fashioned, but in fact it still had these Tiffany interiors, but that modern Victorian eclectic look that was created for the elite in the Gilded Age had suddenly come to look representative of the mass production of the late 19th century, coming out of factories being consumed by middle-class Americans everywhere. And so McKim, Mead, and White, and specifically Stanford White, who really is a decorator as well as an architect, he does all the interiors in the White House, everywhere, both floors. He realizes that the White House has to separate itself from that middle-class ideal that all the first ladies have maintained. He takes over. He basically wrestles with Edith Roosevelt in a metaphorical sense, who clings to some of the Victorian stuff, like the Lincoln bed, which he would have burned in the front yard, and which isn't even the Lincoln bed. Lincoln never touched it, but anyway, it becomes the Lincoln bed.